In the next video we're going to look at how we can use user openings, not to create an opening but to actually trim the tops of our walls there for our roofs. So we'll centre the axes first of all, and we shall make the roof layer, the editable layer, by F2 to bring up the window editor. Let's make the windows and external doors layer hittable. Double click on our layer name here to make the roofs layer editable, and let's select the primitive that makes up the bulk of the roof area. In fact, this particular object only has one primitive, but that's not too important for what we're doing now. We just need to select that particular primitive. Click on Object, Rename Selection, and we just add the first facet, User Opening, colon. Click on OK. Press Ctrl and Q to bring up the Properties panel and set the user opening object style. Come down to the bottom and we've got the two primitive properties set for the selected primitive, and we just want to make sure that the roof is visible in selected views, and we put P for perspective, E for elevation, G for GA plan, and D for detail for now. And just click somewhere else in the panel to make sure that takes, and close the panel. And we need to now create ourselves a cutter primitive. The cutter primitive is what is going to remove the upper part of this wall after we've carried out a few more shall we say interesting steps. So we'll switch to our 2D plan view and set the Z=0 lock on to make sure that the rectangle's been drawn from a point snap on the two opposite corners of the roof extent itself. Unlock the Z value, switch to the perspective window, and you'll see the rectangle is highlighted down here, and we can now use solid construct extrude and snap somewhere lower than the lowest point of the roof and somewhere higher than the highest point of the wall. We're not really too worried about the precise positions, just so long as the shape at least covers the roof itself and the wall that we're trying to modify. Okay, now before we set the properties for this cutter clump, we need to just shape it to match the roof profile. And in anticipation of what we were doing here, I'd actually set the axes onto the underside of the roof when I created the hook point. So if we just do a reset onto the roof, the axes move exactly to the right position in the right direction, so we can then use a boolean slice delete below to chop off the bottom edge of the cutter primitive. We can now go to Ctrl Q and set the cutter primitive property. Any value will do. MicroGDS doesn't care what you put in here, so we'll just put a Y to say yes. And we need to set a representation of M so that the cutter itself is visible when the object is the only selected object. And again, snap somewhere else in the box to set that value, and we can close it. Set the axes center again. Now, it hasn't immediately cut the wall because we haven't established a link between the user opening intelligent object and the IFC wall standard case intelligent object. Establishing the link between the roof and the wall requires us to move the wall into position with a snap on the wall itself. Now, the roof's already in position, so there's absolutely no point to doing a move onto itself, and that would actually fail anyway. So we need to use a little trick to get it back into its original position, and one of the simplest ways of doing that is to select the roof object and do object hook with a M snap on the vertical line that forms the corner of the wall that we're moving it onto. We can then move the object away, and then using an origin snap, an O snap on the roof, and I've programmed my right mouse button with origin snap, and then an M snap on the wall, we can bring it back into position. It'll take a little moment to think about that, and then quite cheerfully it chops off a section of wall that's coincident with the cutter primitive that we've created. Dealing with the curved roof over the workshop area at the rear is a very similar process, slightly more complicated by the fact that we have to create a more complex profile to cut the end of the wall here in the curve that follows the curve of the roof. We'll turn off all of the layers other than the roof layer. So F2, right click, invert selection, invisible, so that we can work with just these roofs visible. And let's copy this roof here 100 meters away in the x-axis, and that gives us a duplicate of the two solids that make up the roof itself, which we can then convert to 2D graphics. So for solid, clump, unclump, so everything is now, all of these surfaces are now outlined with 2D lines. Select all of the graphics apart from these two curves that form the end of the roof. Need to orbit a bit more, so we can select just those pieces there. We can then use Alter Glue to glue the two together, and then we can use Path Delete to remove the upper half, and it'll find the short path around the 2 points that we're interested in, but if you press the space bar it'll force it to go around the long route. We can then set our axes into position, spin them by the Y axis and by 90 degrees, so that the working plane is now set onto the arc of the roof profile. The rectangle command, let's use a nice large rectangle, 25 meters should be sufficient from the end there to the end there. We can delete the bottom segment, and then we can use intersect to connect these graphics together. So we've now got a closed primitive that we can extrude that will follow exactly the profile of the roof. Again, we just need to wheel around a little so that we can see what we're doing. Give the solid construct extrude command and snap on one end of the roof and then on the other end. And let's just zoom in to make sure that what we're looking at is an exact profile of the roof. And there we go. Profile is following the underside. Quite happy with that. Yep. And we can then change the name of the object, so object to rename selection, and we just add up the beginning, the user opening, colon, first facet, Control Q, set the object style, where are we, object style to user opening. We're not going to set the primitive styles yet because we don't want the in fact actually we can, because the profile is already set, so we don't need to worry about losing it. So let's set the primitive style for the cutter, and that's going to be quite simply any value here. Just going to use a Y for the cutter and then an M for the representation so that it's visible when it's selected. And for the two visible portions of the roof, again Control Q, primitive representation. I'm going to use all four again of perspective, elevation, GA and detail. Just click elsewhere, close that. Okay, we can turn everything back on now. Hittable. Sorry, that's editable. Right click, invert selection and hittable. And we'll make sure that everything's owned, which it already is. Click on close.